Labor frontbencher Joel Fitzgibbon almost looked for a while like losing his seat at the last election, a 14% plus swing against him. And that was a shock because Fitzgibbon represents one of the most traditional Labor seats. I mean, it's Hunter in New South Wales, coal mining there, power stations, heavy industry. The message, though, was absolutely clear, and certainly to Fitzgibbon. Labor leader Bill Shorten had called this the global warming election, but his policies were poison with many old Labor voters. And Shorten, you see, had promised huge cuts to greenhouse gases, 45% by 2030. And he did that without explaining even huger costs.
What is the total cost of the economy? What's the impact on GDP growth? What will the impact be on electricity prices? What will the impost be on business? So 4 parts.
All right, 4 parts. I'll try and remember your 4-part question. I'll get Mark to supplement. First of all, what is the cost of not taking action on climate change? It is huge.
And the crazy thing that this wasn't the first time that a Labor leader had been crippled by going far too far with global warming. I mean, there was Kevin Rudd's Prime Ministership. That was weakened by this grandstanding.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
Julia Gillard's Prime Ministership was wrecked by this broken promise.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Well, has Labor learned these hard lessons at last? Well, you know, maybe not, given Labor MPs are now blaming this drought on global warming, when even one of our most committed climate scientists, Professor Andy Pittman, admits that there is actually no link between global warming and drought.
This may not be what you expect to hear, but as far as the climate scientists know, there is no link between climate change and drought. Now, that may not be what you read in the newspapers and sometimes hear commented, but there is no reason a priori why climate change should make the landscape more arid. And if you look at the Bureau of Meteorology data over the whole of the last 100 years, there's no trend in data. There is no drying trend. The fundamental problem we have is we don't understand what causes droughts.
And in fact, Australia's rainfall over the century has increased. But back to Joel Fitzgibbon, Labor's Agriculture and Resources spokesman. He's had enough of Labor's warmist extremism, and tonight he's giving a speech saying that Labor should drop its promise to cut our greenhouse gases by 45% by 2030 and simply copy the Liberals' much lower target instead, 26 to 28%. I was joined earlier by Joel Fitzgibbon. Joel Fitzgibbon, thank you so much for your time. Look, the Liberals' Malcolm Turnbull, he twice lost his leadership by pushing his party too hard on global warming. Labor's Kevin Rudd, his leadership was weakened when he called global warming the greatest moral challenge of our generation. And Julia Gillard's leadership was crippled by her broken promise there'll be no carbon tax. And now we've got Bill Shorten just having lost what he called the climate election. Global warming does seem fatal for leaders who promise too much, doesn't it?
Yeah, Andrew, it's certainly claimed a few victims. And, you know, I'm very determined that Labor should win the next federal election. But in any case, you know, we haven't been able to take the electorate with us. And I think the best way to get there is to try to reach some bipartisanship on the issue. And, you know, we need to call out Scott Morrison. Emissions are growing year on year, and they have been for the last 4 years. And part of the problem there, of course, is that he always deflects questions about that by talking ad nauseum about Labor's more ambitious targets. So I say, let's pull back, let's put the focus on him, let's put the pressure on him to actually turn that around and start reducing emissions. Let's make him put himself on track to fulfil his Paris commitments, his obligations, and in 3 years that would leave us in a better place to build on something more ambitious.
Is there much support in the party for what you're arguing?
I genuinely haven't had an opportunity to talk to any of my colleagues today, Andrew, but I certainly know that members and candidates in rural and regional Australia, particularly those who were unsuccessful, will agree that we can't win government without securing the requisite number of rural and regional seats, and we can't win rural and regional seats while ever our message is not clear about our support for the blue collar workforce in those regions.
Well, speaking of that, you're saying in your speech that if Labor could, or whoever, could get to 28% cuts in emission by 2030, that's the Liberal policy, not the Labor one, and then also demonstrate that you could do that without destroying blue-collar jobs, then you'd have a great foundation to argue the case for more ambitious targets later on. But, Joel Fitzgibbon, what if the blue-collar jobs are destroyed, say in mining or industries that use a lot of electricity? Would you then change your mind about raising the target?
The key point here, Andrew, is that I'm absolutely convinced that we can take meaningful action on climate change without forsaking jobs. So, 28% may or may not be enough to fulfil our Paris obligations, but can we just get somewhere rather than go backwards every year? And if we could get to 28% by 2030 without losing jobs, then that would be a fantastic foundation on which to say to blue-collar workers in particular, look, we've demonstrated it can be done, and then we can have a conversation about doing something more ambitious. But at the moment, Labor's last policy isn't having any impact because we're in opposition, and Scott Morrison's policy, or the lack of it, is causing emissions to grow every year. So, it makes common sense. It's common sense to me to say, gee, maybe we need to reposition here and take a new approach.
The way you're arguing, it seems pretty clear that you've decided that global warming policies, Labor's policies, cost the election. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking Labor to change them. Have I summarised your view correctly?
Oh, there is no doubt, Andrew, that our climate change policy had a big impact on our election loss. I mean, there were a whole suite of things that are also in that mix, but this has damaged us electorally before. My view is we're a little bit slow learning our lessons. But the worst part for me, well, is two things really. One, we're letting Scott Morrison off the hook because every time he gets hit with this question about emissions rising under his regime, he just segues to Labor's more ambitious targets and says, oh, well, the world would be a worse place even if Labor were in power. And two, the great tragedy is emissions are growing every year, Andrew. So I've said in the speech, we need to be realists, not idealists. We can stick to very ambitious targets, and that might make us feel good, but for the next 3 years under that scenario, emissions will continue to rise.
My thing here is, you say we've got to do something about global warming, but as I keep pointing out, and as the chief scientist admits, that whatever we do will make no difference. And this is what annoys me, that we're being asked to make huge sacrifices. You see what's happened to our power bills. And this has an effect on blue-collar jobs, of course, if electricity's too expensive, as well as the pensioners. It's all for nothing. So I just wonder why Labor keeps pushing policies that inevitably hurt people but don't actually do anything for, to stop temperatures.
The problem, though, Andrew, is that electricity prices are rising under the government, under the current...
Oh, I got that, because they're going along with it, Joel. I want to go back to the basic line that I agree with you. The power prices have been rising, and the government's also drinking the global warming Kool-Aid. But the point is, why would Labor be demanding people make sacrifices when it doesn't actually do anything to stop temperatures rising?
Well, I believe that if the architecture put in place by the Labor government, the architecture Tony Abbott repealed, I believe we'd be making solid gains on carbon emission reductions now, and there would be no cost. And energy prices would probably be lower, because what's driving higher energy prices in the main is investor uncertainty, because we've had this blue about carbon ever since, and Scott Morrison's sort of half in the tent. He says he's taking it seriously. He says he's doing something about it, but he doesn't really have the architecture. The investors know that, and so they don't know what the rules are going to look like into the future. And the government's being called out by its own regulatory bodies today on that issue. Their silly piecemeal intervention is only making the electricity price situation worse.
Well, I'll leave aside that argument about the idea that these policies can cost nothing. They all do cost something, and they don't do anything. But I'm just finally, these Extinction Rebellion protests we see at the moment, people blocking city roads, before there was the school strike, children being filmed crying that, we're facing mass extinction, probably the collapse of civilization. You've got retired Admiral Chris Barry writing in The Conversation this week that, civilization could collapse in 2050. Do you believe any of this stuff really?
Well, again, Andrew, I just ask you to stick your head out of the window and have a look at what's happening. Our firefighters are out there risking their lives today in very early and intense bushfires. I don't know what happened in 1901, but I visited towns where there literally is no water, or at least they're about to be without water. I spent the week on a dairy farm, and it was just devastating to see where we once saw green pastures, we now just see dust. So again,
well, you just asked me to stick my head out the window. Yeah, but when you say stick my head out the window, I also look at the data. Australia's getting more rain now than it has over the last century. We've got top experts like Andy Pittman saying, no, there's no link between drought and global warming. We've had drought and fire before. We've had NASA saying there's been a quarter less area burnt by wildfires around the world, and they include Australia in that, in the last 18 years. I mean, what you're saying is anecdotal, but Australia's a land of drought and flooding rain. It's not unusual. And I don't know why people go, lose their head over this. But the idea that we're facing imminent civilizational collapse in 2050 or whenever it is, do you actually believe that? I'm sure you don't. You can't. I respect you too much.
Well, for every scientist you can find that says there's no link between human activity and climate change, I'll find you 20 scientists who are prepared to say the opposite. But let me make this point. If what you're saying is true, why doesn't Scott Morrison just say he's not taking any action on climate change? That would be a
good question, Joel. Leave it at that, because that is a good question.
Well, because what he's saying is he believes in it. He says his government is taking action, but on his own inventory, his own advice, emissions are growing every year. So he can't have it both ways.
No, unfortunately he can, because we are doing a lot and it doesn't work. And it won't make any difference anyway, and people are paying a lot for nothing. But that's regardless of who's in power, it seems to me. Joel Fitzgibbon, regardless of that, I do wish you the best, because I don't think Labor can survive unless it takes advice like yours very, very seriously. So thank you very much for talking to us.